There are a lot of examples in history on really large scales of how, when we are micromanaged as humans, we perform a lot worse. And one that's on a macro scale that has a handful of examples is the Soviet Union. And there's a story in the Soviet Union about these nail factories. And maybe you've heard of this. I think it's the most popular story. But these nail factories required certain quotas. And they had to meet those quotas, or else there were consequences. And so they had to meet these quotas of weight. They had to produce tons of nails in order to meet this quota of weight. And so we as humans don't like to be micromanaged. So these factories created these nails that were super heavy and pretty much unable to be used. Okay, well, the government caught on to that. They realized that, and so they made the quota that they have to produce a certain amount of nails now. Well, we humans don't like to be micromanaged, and so they produced tons of tiny nails that were flimsy, that wouldn't even work, and they made thousands and thousands of them. That's, this one example on a macro scale. We as humans weren't made to micromanage each other, and we weren't made to be micromanaged. We perform poorly when that happens. It's very interesting because sometimes we are even tempted to micromanage our own selves when it comes to our walk with God. And that can be devastating to our spiritual life. So here's the process I'm talking about. When we feel like we're not doing okay with the Lord, with walking with Him, we fear or we despair. And then we double down our effort and subconsciously try to micromanage our own souls to get it back to where we think we need to be. So we feel like we're not doing okay. We fear. We despair. We double down our effort. I gotta try harder to get back to being right with the Lord. This is an assumption we have in our souls. We assume we need to put more effort in, be more in control. That seems natural to us. And there's a lot of things in life where we naturally think if we grip harder, if we have more control, we will be safe. But in reality, it's more dangerous. So there's not only the monumental macro scale example like the Soviet Union, but there's also these small everyday life examples. And one example of this is driving on ice or in the rain. Have you ever had your car slip? I have. It was very scary in Virginia. I was driving in the snow on the highway, and the car started sliding. And you think you need to slam on the brake or jerk the wheel back over. But that's the worst thing you could do. You have to steer into the skid and then pump the brake. Am I right on that? I don't want to give any legal advice. It won't snow soon here, yeah, but you never know. The harder we try to fall asleep, the more awake we become. When you grip a bat or a golf club harder, it ruins your swing as compared to maybe a looser, more relaxed grip, which can actually have more power. We do the same thing spiritually. When we're trying to walk in godliness, when we're trying to turn back to God from sinning, even with the case that we might be going through persecution, like the Philippians, we begin to fear or despair, and we grip harder, and we begin to try and micromanage our souls. And this sense of trying to be more in control is actually more harmful to ourselves. With time, we need to train our thoughts to breathe and trust Christ, to be involved still, but rest our whole involvement in his abilities. Because Philippians 1:6 is the context of our salvation and of our sanctification. The context is that he who began a good work will complete it. So let's read that. Philippians 1, verse 6. Philippians 1, verse 6. It says, I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. We're going a couple of verses at a time, sometimes one verse at a time. And that's what we're focusing on this morning, this specific verse. He who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. So, the focus is training our thoughts against a micromanaged mind. Training our thoughts against a micromanaged mind. A micromanaging mindset is the opposite mindset of one who trusts that he who began a good work in us will bring it to completion. So this morning, I don't have main points, but main questions arising from the passage that will go against a micromanaging mind, which we need to frequently ask ourselves. And this first one is, did I begin this? Did I begin this work of God in my own life? No. It is he who began. He is the author. And I love thinking about this. I love thinking about this in life in general. When I look at where I am and what I've been through, I never thought I'd be here. And I think many of you can say that. Every step of the way, God started a thought in my heart, which over time developed into big steps toward some new path. But it always starts small. And Zechariah 4:10 says, do not despise small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin. And this was in the context of when the Israelites were rebuilding after the exile. Do not despise small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin. Another is Matthew 13:31, where Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, and that small seed grows to be one of the largest trees, so that the birds come and perch in its branches. We sometimes forget this with Christianity, that it began with 12 guys, minus one. This is how God begins things. He grew it from there, and he loves to begin things like that. The small beginnings, like little micro creations in our lives into worlds we never imagined. But the main place he does this is within our souls. The main place that matters is in terms of salvation. So 2 Corinthians 4:6 says, for God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So what he does in saving our souls is literally parallel to the first work of creation. Our hearts were empty and void, nothing but darkness. There was no prior spiritual material God could work with in us. And God spoke and shone in the dark void of our hearts. He began this work. He worked your salvation. The scriptures not only use creation as parallel to salvation, but also rising from the dead. So Ephesians 2:1 talks about how we were dead in sin. And verse 5 says, when we were dead in our trespasses, God made us alive together with Christ. We were dead in relation to God with no ability to reconcile until we heard his voice when we were in the tomb. And isn't that interesting? In John 5:25, it actually says, when Jesus comes back, the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God. So even though we were lifeless spiritually, we somehow could still hear the voice of the Son of God by faith. The place where you have no power, the place where you are motionless, can do nothing. That is where the Son of God speaks and says, rise. And in your death, you hear by faith. And you rise, and new life begins. He began this. Some might say about their personal lives, well, yeah, but I started looking for a church. He began that thought. Yeah, but I started reading my Bible. He began that thought. Yeah, but I chose to give my life to Christ. He began that thought and provided everything necessary for your life. You might look out and see all the technical pieces that came together, but he was behind that. You might see the motivations involved and the people who helped you, but he began it all. And I think Acts 17:26 really brings some clarity to this. Acts 17:26 speaks of how God determined the place and the time for every single person to be born, the place to live, so that you should seek God and perhaps feel your way toward him and find him. So the scriptures speak of us as dead, as we saw earlier, and here in Acts 17 as blind, and yet we're able to hear the voice of the Son of God if we have faith, and we're able to seek God and feel our way toward him if we have faith. And that's the mystery, isn't it? There is an interaction between God and human that cannot be solved. I don't want to parse that out. I don't think you can. I don't think that's a problem that is meant to be solved. But all we know is that this reconciliation, this relationship, this salvation is a gift from him. And so it is meant to be that we simply confess and proclaim that God began it all. We affirm that he is the only sole creator of the world, but the sole creator of our salvation as well. He created ex nihilo, out of nothing, and he created the new creation, our salvation ex nihilo, out of nothing. No spiritual material. So how does that help with not micromanaging our souls? I think it gives us complete assurance and peace. We can rest and put down the need for trying to figure it all out, because we know there was nothing inherent in us that causes God to want to stop this work. If he began it apart from us, he's the one who started it even when we were enemies. He's the one who started it even when we were dead to him. He started it then. And so when we think God wants to be done with us, that's just thinking of God as a human. We might think that way in a workplace when a client gets really hard to work with. Well, the boss can say, I'm done, just cut ties. And sadly, we see this in the most intimate relationship, where we should be seeing the unbreakable love of God, but we see two humans limited in their love. So we consider God like a human. He must be ready to cut ties with me. He must be ready to divorce me after what I've done. No, it was when you were an enemy, when you were dead, when there was nothing but darkness in your heart, that he chose to begin this work. And so you can be fully assured that this is more than about you. This is more than your performance. This work of salvation didn't start because you were smart or already godly or wise or had great potential or honest or kind or disciplined, or that you've always been spiritual or religious, or that you're a natural leader or successful. None of these things within you is why God began this work. And so you can be assured he won't stop. And if these things that you might esteem now falter or change in the future, you know he won't stop because of that. He will conform you to the image of his Son. I think of David. He wasn't chosen because he had potential. All that we see is he had potential to sin. And he did quite often, multiple times, even towards the end of his life again, in a major way that caused a plague to kill hundreds of thousands of people. We don't talk about that sin of David. He wasn't chosen because he had potential. Well, watch how many times. Seems like he had to come start over. Ask for forgiveness again. Our lives are crazy. We don't know what will happen or who we will become, but we know that God started this work, and we can always go back to that. If we need to start over and just say, Lord, you began this. What do you want me to do? Who do you want me to become? I surrender to you. The next question to ask ourselves is, could I sustain this? No. It is he who holds the universe together by the word of his power. Hebrews 1:2 says, Christ upholds the universe by the word of his power. Christ sustains all things. Well, if he sustains all things, I guess I just don't need to do anything. No. Don't panic. I think that when I hear that answer, it reminds me of a kid who might be carrying, a cup of milk or some type of liquid, and they're being so careful, and then they spill a little, and they look at it, and for some reason they panic. And the parent is like, don't you dare. And they just dump it all on the floor. I don't know why kids do that. But they panic, and then they just start crying. And it's like, you could have just kept going. That's how I see people who answer this like that. Oh, well, I guess I don't need to do anything if Christ sustains it all. Dump. There's a fine line between our involvement and our taking over this whole project of salvation. And you want to know the difference? The difference is in your mind. When you start thinking you are in more control than you are. That's why we don't notice that, I need to give it up to God, until we gripped too hard and we see it months later or years later, because it started in our mind and in our beliefs, in the thinking of our hearts. And that takes time to develop certain actions and build up our stress and anxiety over time to where we're just so overwhelmed because we took on more control than we should have. Okay, well, maybe the question is how much control and involvement of this is too little and how much is too much? How are we involved? Well, that's called the narrow road, of which we're all continually aiming to stay within. And here's what Paul says about this. If we were to ask, what is that narrow road? What's our involvement? What's our role in this? He says this later in Philippians 2:12 through 13. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. That's how the Bible balances it. Fully man, work out your salvation. Fully God, for it is God who works in you. So you are fully involved, and God is fully involved, but on a greater and more bigger and smaller detail scale than we even know. But it says there's fear and trembling. Yes. So isn't that a consequence of micromanaging your salvation? Yes and no. It could be. There's an unhealthy fear and trembling and despair and anxiety when you are micromanaging your soul. And that is called fearful self-reliance. Fearful self-reliance. But there is a healthy fear and trembling, which is called the fear of God. When we realize the magnitude of what he's doing in us and the greatness of who's involved. There's a great book called Rejoice and Tremble by Michael Reeves. A few of us have read that here. It's the surprising good news of the fear of the Lord. So rejoice and tremble, the surprising good news of the fear of the Lord. And he brings out this excellent point, which is that when we do not fear God with a healthy fear, that biblical fear, we fear everything else more to a disproportionate degree. And so he argues that is the cause of great anxiety in our culture, even though we're a highly safe country and have high levels of comfort compared to other countries. And so this fear and trembling is not fearful self-reliance, but a healthy fear of God. And this is how we can know. Psalm 2:11 speaks of this almost word for word. Psalm 2:11. It says, serve the Lord with fear, rejoice with trembling. I said this in the past couple of sermons. Paul doesn't just pull out these terms out of thin air. This is deeply ingrained in the Old Testament, right here in Psalm 2:11. Serve the Lord with fear, rejoice with trembling. Fear and trembling. And there in Psalm 2, it includes rejoice with trembling. There's joy mixed into this fear and trembling. It is healthy. Why do we have this fear and rejoicing with trembling? Because it is God who works in you. It is God who works in you. Our proximity to God causes us to fear and tremble and rejoice and not shrink back and work out our salvation, for it is Him who works in us, both to will and to do. We will with His will, and we do with His doing. So both God and man are fully involved in this. And when you will without His willing and do without His doing, then you fall into the ditch on either side of the narrow road. Whether that's being apathetic, I don't have to do anything, Christ will sustain it all. Or doubling down in micromanaging, all on your own. There's the ditch on the right. Can we sustain this? No. but we grip so hard that we just drive into one ditch or the other. Sometimes both in the same day. Christ sustains. He holds together the universe by the word of his power, and by his word, he keeps you in this narrow path, sustaining your direction as you drive forward dependent on his word. So how do we trust Christ to sustain instead of micromanaging ourselves to sustain? Well, let me first say that the things of the mind are not measurable. You cannot measure it. We see the effects and consequences of thinking, which are more measurable, but we can't measure the degrees of how much we are trusting and how much we're thinking this or that and balancing everything rightly and not forgetting this and remembering that. I think a lot of us would love that, because then we'd know, oh, I'm doing good. I'm doing good now. If we could measure it. Or you can know, I'm not doing good, and here are the practical steps. Here's the how-to just get myself back. No, it's not like that. It's not something that you can measure and therefore master. And I'm sorry, because we want that so bad. We try to force it to be like that. But it's a relationship. It's a relationship. And that's what it comes down to. Is our relationship continual? Do you keep seeking? Do you keep reading? Do you keep repenting when you sin? Do you keep turning back to him? Do you keep trusting? Do you keep going? Do you keep growing? Do you keep abiding? Do you keep thinking the way God thinks? Do you keep training your thoughts aligned with his word? It's a continual relationship with him. So how do we trust Christ to sustain instead of micromanage ourselves to sustain? I mean, it's something you learn from the Spirit. No man can really teach you how to do this. And that's why God has to be so involved in this. The Spirit somehow teaches us in every thought and circumstance to put more trust in Christ than ourselves, to the point where over time that trust grows. And you could say, or at least you're aiming for all your trust to be in him to sustain you. So I'm sorry if that is not a satisfactory answer, because we really want the simple how-to. But life is not that way, and you know that. It requires a constant, continual dependence upon Christ. It's a relationship. Then the last question, will I complete this? Will I complete this? No. He will bring to completion. He is the author and the finisher of our faith. And micromanagers have difficulty delegating. Give him the power. Give him the power. What does it look like to entrust the completion to Christ? First, it's not constantly checking your spiritual temperature. Sometimes it looks like we have such a far way to go. And we are constantly looking at ourselves and assessing ourselves, and it just bends us inward and creates, like last week's sermon, a self-consumed mind. This is for the overthinkers, so I won't spend any more time on this thought, but it needed to be said. Don't constantly check your spiritual temperature. Then, seek perfection instead of being perfectionists. Perfectionists can be micromanagers, and micromanagers are rigid. They want perfectionism, which is to have an abstract goal of what they think is best, which is almost always a moving goalpost, which is why perfectionists never feel like they're good enough, because they keep moving that goalpost, and why they think others are never good enough. Perfectionism is requiring a lot from yourself and others, making us too quick to correct and criticize. There's no area for grace there. Grace towards themselves from God. When you reject God's grace, that is because of pride. And no grace towards others. Like the parable of the man who was forgiven this huge debt, but when he was managing his money, he required a small debt from someone else. I think that's a good picture of perfectionism. But we have certain verses, like Matthew 5:48, where Jesus calls us to be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. We have Philippians 3:12, which we'll go through eventually, where Paul says he hasn't achieved perfection, but is pressing on to take hold of completion. And 2 Corinthians 7:1. I want to read this one. It says, "Since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit and bring holiness to completion in the fear of God." I think that's really similar to the Philippians 2:12 passage. You have that component of the fear of God there. Bring holiness to completion. So we are to aim for perfection, but we have to define what perfect is. What is perfection? And if you think of anything other than Christ alone, you're wrong. Perfection, what is perfect, is Christ alone. And so it's not some abstract standard we create. That is perfectionism. So to seek perfection biblically, to seek completion, is synonymous with seek Christ. And when we are fully conformed to Christ, we are perfect. And that day will only come in heaven. But we genuinely and zealously strive for it here, because this is his work he's doing in us. He's bringing us to completion. And so we are involved by seeking completion or perfection or Christ himself in conformity to him. And doing that is going to deliver all perfectionists from perfectionism. That is your freedom if you are a perfectionist. The standard is Christ. That's the only standard. Seek him. In seeking him, you are walking in the process God intended of entrusting completion to him. So when we feel like we're not doing okay in walking with the Lord, we fear or we despair. Then we double down our effort and subconsciously try to micromanage our souls to get back to where we think we need to be. And a micromanaging mind seems like it will solve the problem until we're overwhelmed with too much to change and fix. We can't keep up. The Spirit has to manage our salvation. Christ, who holds the universe together, will sustain it, and he will complete it. Train your thoughts against micromanaging your salvation by frequently asking those questions. Did I begin this? Could I sustain this? And will I complete this? And there, you can have peace that Christ is all, the author, the sustainer, and finisher, even as you are fully involved in this work. Let's pray.